So, what happens if you scale a company without pricing power is you can often end up in a situation where you're working essentially the same amount and making the same amount. Hey, podcast listener, even if you are alone in your entrepreneurial journey, know that today, right now in your earbuds, you are joined by thousands of entrepreneurs from all around the globe seeking to grow better, more profitable, location-independent businesses. If you'd like to learn more about what we do and download our entire back catalog, check out tropicalmba.com. So, Ian, the fundamental question of this episode is, it feels like you can kind of put any business into one of two camps. On the one hand, you have businesses that have some kind of sustainable pricing power and leverage. And then there's other businesses that sort of feel like a grind or a job for the owner. The question is what camp is your business in, and how can we transition from one to the other? This episode is based on this excellent book called 7 Powers, The Foundations of Business Strategy. It's by a gentleman named Hamilton Helmer. So essentially what the book does is it defines why some businesses are always facing margin pressure and constant competition versus the businesses that are able to sustain margins and pricing over time. For bootstrappers, you might interpret that as an asset that feels like an opportunity to own versus an asset where you're always just looking for opportunities about how to improve your business. How do we make our business more powerful? The 7 Powers book walks us through the 7 key methodologies for doing so. What we're going to try to do today is translate how those concepts can apply to bootstrappers. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But first, some housekeeping at the top of the episode. The first is one of the things we're doing right now for DC Accelerator, which is our coaching program, is we're doing these onboarding calls with the detailed diagnostics. If you listened to last week's episode, you heard some of those diagnostic questions. When we get off these calls, we are glowing at either the opportunity, the potential, or the low-hanging fruit that a lot of founders have to take it to their next level. It's always easier to look at somebody else's business than to look at yours, because yours feels like a cruise ship. You know what I mean? Like it's just show today, show next week. We're making changes very slowly. But when you look across the aisle, it's like, oh, we're just going to knock these things out.
So easy. I can't believe you haven't done this yet. My gosh.
And we understand both sides of that token. It's really, really fun. It's like just business nerdery, digging into where people are at and how they can make changes. The thought I had was like, man, these calls are so electric. I wish we could share them on the podcast. But of course we can't, because there's a lot of sensitive information. And then I thought, but what if we could? What if we could share some of these under the hood moments of businesses right now? What's happening right now versus a lot of the things we feature on the show are things that happened 3, 5, 7 years ago. And so here's the pitch. If you would like to come on this podcast or submit your story, drop me an email. Our emails are Dan and Ian, respectively, at this domain. And let us know what your real numbers are, your revenue and profit. Let us know what's effed up in your business. Let us know what's good about it. And let us know how we can help. And let's start the discussion. We want to see if there's a few businesses we could either share with the founder or perhaps anonymize the business slightly and dig into it how we would on a coaching call right here on the podcast. So this is something, if you're on our email list, we'll send this out as well. I think it's just an interesting idea, Ian. It's so illuminating to see the real details. This is what happens at DC events. This is what happens on our coaching calls. And I thought, man, maybe we should try to get this stuff onto the podcast, because when you can see the sorts of mistakes or wins that other founders are making and the data is real, something about that for me is very compelling and inspiring.
Yeah, I've gotten to see hundreds of these businesses on these calls the last 18 months. And I have a formula now during these calls for how I extract information. The first half of the call, I'm trying to learn as much as I possibly can about the business as quick as I possibly can. to then understand, are we a good fit together? Is this something that, should we be working together? But then also just understand kind of the status of the business. Is this a good business? Is this a great business? What are the opportunities in here? And so I think once you contact us, I'm really looking forward to this too, Dan. Once you contact us, it'll give us the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper. And then I think the opportunity to share your story on this show in a way that will excite listeners and then also hopefully get you a bunch of value back. So I think the worry for a lot of people about like sharing this information, some people are just totally open book. I talked to a guy the other day. He's like, look, the more I share this information, the more it comes back to me in the universe. And that might sound like kooky in a way, but I think it's true. The more you put your problems out there, the more likely they are to get solved.
Yeah, you're building a coalition.
Yeah, exactly.
And a lot of people have the answers to whatever challenge you're facing.
So the idea here, Dan, is super exciting because this is, for me, what we've been doing the last 18 months is gathering this information and then getting to share it with y'all. I think you guys are going to get to see there are so many businesses like yours out there. You had a friend told a story to me the other day. They were listening to Dave Ramsey. The guy was in like serious debt.
So Dave Ramsey's a famous radio host,
right,
who talks about financial freedom and debt.
And you're explaining, he's listening, and this guy is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he has all this debt. This is just unbelievable. And then he looked in the mirror and he's like, wait, I'm that idiot. The guy listening in was actually the guy calling in, right? And I think that this is also what's going to happen here too, which is you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I got a gold mine on my plate here. I got the same business. I'm just not operating it in the same way. Or, oh my gosh, I've got a real turd on my hands here. This person's in trouble. I've known I've been in trouble too for the last 2 years, but until I heard this, I didn't really think it was me.
Yeah, I mean, that coalition, and that's even the value that we've seen in bringing coaches in, which is like, sometimes you need to do something like pay off your debt or make a change. And it's not just about the information, but it's sometimes when someone's there holding your hand through it, it just makes it easier. It's that accountability. Well, I agreed with these 5 smart people that I need to do this. Can I show up next month to the party and have not done it? I can, but that hurdle is sometimes all it takes to make the right decision. One final thing I'll mention about this under the hood, the reason we haven't done this to date is the issue of discretion. And so if you share with us your business in email, the only 3 people that are going to see that information are Ian, myself, and the podcast producer. We also have a commitment to ourselves where we do not share this information in conversation. That's our promise to the listeners, and you can judge for yourselves. But that's something that we take seriously. So if you want to have your business broken down by Ian and myself, just drop us an email this week. Let us know what your revenue is, what your profit is, what's messed up, what's good, and how we can help. And then we'll see. We'll run a little experiment here and see what we can cook up on the podcast. Okay, Ian, if you don't have enduring pricing power, you're essentially constantly playing an arbitrage game. What's the difference between a business who it doesn't matter where the delivery team is, that price point is going to stay the same, and it might even go up over time. And it might not feel like a grind because there's margin there. So maybe the best way to think about the lens of power is, why are some businesses able to maintain margin in dynamic market conditions when other businesses are constantly grinding out deals and grinding out arbitrages? The line in the sand could be defined this way, and I'm just coming up with this off the top of my head, so give me your judgment. There's certain businesses that are always looking for opportunities. And then there's certain businesses that owning them is the opportunity. And if you feel like you're on one side of the fence, typically the idea is going to be to figure out a way to get to the other side. That owning the asset itself is the opportunity. And what we're going to talk about today is some ways of thinking about how to get across that line in the sand. There's a bunch of different types of power. We're going to talk through some of them today. The one that most of us start with is one called a cornered resource. And this is commonly how businesses get started, is you identify a cornered resource. The problem is for most businesses, that cornered resource is the founder's time and talent. And then the question is can you progress that resource onto other forms of power?
So give me an example of a cornered resource. One I'm thinking of here is the kid that has access to his dad's 20 supercars on YouTube.
Yeah. The Seven Powers framework uses like Fortune 500 and startup companies as their case studies. So what we're really trying to do is figure out how bootstrappers participate in the same concept. And I do think you're right, Ian. If you're a 20-year-old kid and your dad's a billionaire, and there's an example of this on YouTube, quite famous channel, it's got a 50 car collection, and most people that have 50 dream cars aren't in the YouTube generation. And so relative to the competition, this kid's got a cornered resource, which is these 50 cars that he can drive around in all the time. And there you go. That's like similar to the founder of a marketing services company who used to work at a company doing PPC or whatever and says, wow, I can hang my shingle up and now sell this cornered resource, which is my expertise. And the unique combination of my personality, my contacts, and this expertise, that's sort of good enough to get a business started. But it's not the type of cornered resource that's going to give you sustaining pricing power over time unless you really brand yourself. So that's another one, brand, and you emerge as someone who's known, and there's a bunch of ways you can do this, as the best in the world or the best in a community, the best in a discipline. And then you can cross your arms and say, I don't get out of bed for less than $3,000 an hour. And there are people who do focus on a combination of that corner resource of like, I've worked with these 15 companies. I've helped them make X millions of dollars. I'll do it for your company. And I do it solo. And that's actually leverage enough to run a great profitable business, especially when you break it down by your hourly input. That is a way to break out of this grindy feeling. We had a case study, a bootstrapper who did this. His name is Vince Wynn, where he's established himself as Facebook PPC. I only get out of bed for X type of clientele. And it's not as grindy as even a company who might have 15 people in the Philippines delivering the same service. So what happens if you scale a company without pricing power is you can often end up in a situation where you're working essentially the same amount and making the same amount. And this is the dynamic that thinking about power can help us to escape. Because what you're essentially doing is you're not developing power, you're just developing scale. And if you do that, if you don't have that pricing power element to it, it's typically never a moment where you can step back, where you can sell, where you can increase your margins. And so this is the common refrain amongst agency owners who scale without power. It's like, well, I didn't develop one of my 7 powers. All I did was develop my delivery team and I developed my clientele. But because there's a lot of competition, one of the relevant concepts to this is Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. He talks about why it's a bad idea to start an airline. Why? Because there's, how many hundreds of airlines all competing with the same business model, all competing with the same basic planes and personnel, and we're all operating at a 3% margin or some years negative. And the reason is because of competition. And there's not one airline who can emerge. And occasionally this will happen with Southwest and Virgin, but then they get pulled back into the pack because they haven't developed one power that allows them to maintain margin over time. And the same thing happens with agencies often. Well, now I found myself, I'm still working 50 hours a week like I did when I was just one person, but now I've got 15 people to manage. And lo and behold, I'm making basically the same amount of money. So while we're on the topic of corner resources, I wanted to maybe explore some other like bootstrappery type. The classic example of a corner resource would be a patent. So you take your expertise and you translate it into an asset in the form of a patent. So the way that I was doing things as an individual is now transferred into this product or this methodology or this process that is now patented. And the
Yeah.
company with that asset is the only company that can deliver that product. So that's one way you can look at it. A cornered resource for a bootstrapper could be a unique brain trust. So the example given in the book is of Pixar Studios, that the actual team that was building these movies, and Pixar just dusted Disney there for a while. No one could touch them. And the reason is the talent that was assembled there was not just like some of the best in the industry, but a mix of technology and culture and perspective on the new way to make movies was enough to create that sustainable, outsized, dramatic edge over time. One example I really like is Rick Beato is a music YouTuber who's built this incredible retirement career for himself, especially through this series called What Makes This Song Great. So he was a record producer for many years out of Atlanta. And so the first video he does on YouTube, he sort of pops up and he's in his studio and he starts breaking down songs, but he does it in a very unique way. He plays what are called stem tracks, which are the individual tracks. Typically a song could have like up to 40, 100. Some early songs might have 20 tracks that sort of all come together to create the song. So he would just like play Kurt Cobain's guitar or Kurt Cobain's backing vocal. And so for the first few years of this, the number one comment was like, how does this guy have these stems? Where are they coming from? Of course, the song is great, but where the hell are these stems coming from? And everyone was blown away by the experience of hearing these classic songs broken down. And that's a really interesting example of him having unique access to an experience. And agency owners have this too. We have an agency owner in DC Black who works with handfuls and handfuls and handfuls of Shopify merchants. So now if you just go on and keep being an agency, now all of a sudden we see a potential cornered resource, which is like, I might be one of the few people in the world that have access to this data set that could actually help a lot of people. Now, how can I exploit that cornered resource in the way that Rick Beato did with those stem tracks? Another example, Chris Voss, who spent years as a high-level hostage negotiator. Well, that experience is rare and unique. And he presented it in a book, hired the best business book writer in the world at the time. Again, back to brand. It's like, I'm just going to go for the best person. Probably had to cut an insane deal there, probably negotiated decently, as he's talked about many times. Well, here's a way to get some power because I know something that very few people know. And my competition is unlikely to expose this information for a variety of reasons. Perhaps they're still employed. And so by putting it out there, I am now the owner of this cornered resource, this specific knowledge. I'm going to present it to business owners. And this is a source of power for now Chris Voss's consulting company.
One of the things that all these examples have in common here is that it doesn't necessarily start off with the cornered resource being a cornered resource. So a lot of times these things take years to mature, or in the case of Pixar, the supercars, you had to have access, and I'm sure his family worked very hard to get those cars in some way. So it's not always a cornered resource when you start. Dan, to your point here, it's what you do with that cornered resource once you identify it.
Yeah.
So I was speaking with somebody actually this morning before I got on this call. They are basically a high-end consultant to people buying and selling their businesses. And so what happens after you talk to people for 5 years in that line of work is you start to have a cornered resource potentially, depending on the way that you view your work. So you could just view your work as, oh, I just help broker deals, basically, or I help the buyer and the seller. And you could wake up 20 years later and that could be it. Your pipeline could dry up. Maybe people love you, maybe they don't, depending on how good you are. Or you could look at the people that you've talked to over the last 20 years and you could say, I identified some trends here. Or, I've worked with these top companies in these top industries now. They all recognize me as something. And so this, a lot of times, I think, is when the pivot happens, is if you can wake up, you can understand your experience, and you can say, hey, this is the next thing. This is what I'm going to do with all this information. This is what I'm going to do with all this data. this is the way I'm going to present it to people now.
I think an interesting one for bootstrappers potentially, and this is like a quasi distribution, quasi corner resource, which is an exclusive partnership, like a contract with an influencer or an athlete or something like that. If you have a contract like we are exclusive partners for these sorts of products. So whenever you use or talk about these products, you could say that's distribution. But if you identify that person early, if you give them equity in your company, if you have some kind of partnership, think of it as a cornered resource. The other thing I've seen is like these unique experiences and unique data and putting them out there. A lot of YouTubers sort of take this strategy. Like there's some guy who lives on a dude ranch or whatever, and everybody wants to go to a dude ranch, but no one's now presenting this as an experience or an asset that can exist as marketing or as attention gathering. And so there's that potential for all of us to take a look at our work and ask ourselves, what is the value of my unique experience and my unique data that could perhaps be presented to the world as a way to get our next PowerPoint distribution? So distribution is the fancy term that we're all using nowadays. That means marketing, I'm pretty sure. I don't know. It sounds cooler. Let's distribute this shit. But I wanted to bring up distribution because at least amongst bootstrappers, having some kind of solid distribution that's reliable seems to be one of the early instances of power that move businesses from I'm looking for opportunities to this business is the opportunity. I mean, one example of one of our members is Lucy Simpkins. She created a YouTube channel that helps people speak English. And it blew up because the way that she teaches is super interesting and engaging. And she came up with a methodology for creating videos that would grow in views and that would build a large, powerful audience. Now, would you rather be in the business where you have this distribution of a huge YouTube channel with 10 million subscribers, or have all the expertise in the world of how to teach people English? And so this is that jump again to gaining power through distribution. We got SEO, you've got social, you've got people who've built multi-million dollar businesses on platforms like Twitter. Look at Dave Perel with Rite of Passage. This is a multi-million dollar growing business. And a lot of that came from Twitter, essentially. But he's very, very good at Twitter. And that was very hard to grow the huge audience that he has here. Everybody, of course, knows about Sweaty Startup. Distribution can start in smaller ways, like it could be in your community standing. It could be in your social network. It could be through an email list. But the challenge here is, can you build a powerful, essentially media element to your brand that over time continues to engage potential new customers? It's a hard challenge to solve, but it's one of the ways that businesses can sustain margin and pricing power over time.
One of the things that I've noticed, Dan, of everybody that we've mentioned on this list so far is I'm pretty sure most of them started with one channel and stuck with one channel for the most part until they reach a certain scale. So YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, doubling down on the channel that really works and going deep before you start to be on 5 or 6 channels. This stuff appears to be free from the outside. It's super expensive. When you dig into like Nick's strategy, Sorty Startup Nick over at Twitter, it's an extremely expensive strategy. So Nick actually spends over $500,000 a year on his strategy.
Yeah.
Super expensive to do this stuff. So when you're looking at it, this stuff is not free. Distribution, of course, is not free, right? When you think about it, you're like, oh, marketing, it's not free. You have to spend a ton of money for this stuff to work.
All right, let's look at some other sources of power. One is networked effects. And the way I think about networked effects for bootstrappers is that, again, we're on the line in the sand. On the line in the sand where you're looking for opportunities, it's often the case that although bringing on more clients brings in more revenue, those more clients can make the business more complicated to operate. And having more clients doesn't benefit your other clients. That's the one side of the fence. This is where you get into Jerry Maguire territory. I'm going to show my age a little bit, but when you're standing in the conference room saying, we want less clients, we want to focus on them, and we just want the best clients at the best price. This is where the service businesses start to squeal. They start to say, why do we have all these clients? Every time we bring on a new client, now we can't focus on our best clients. Why don't we just simplify, become Jerry Maguire? Well, there's another way to do it to build power, which is to change the model so that the clients themselves benefit from the other clients being a part of it. And you can do this with a bunch of ways. You can do it by the proprietary data shares. You can do it from clients delivering customer service to each other. A lot of software companies do this with a community function. You can do this with a community itself. You can build a platform that benefits from more people joining that platform, uploading their data and experiences. And so it's going to be different for every business, but it's worth at least thinking, does my business get better for my customers when more people participate in the business? And I think it's typically a yes or no question for every business. And so how can you migrate your business from a no to a yes? You're starting to think about network effects. Here's another one, counter positioning. So how can bootstrappers take advantage of counter positioning? I think one of the interesting ways to think about counter positioning is, can you charge for the value delivery with a different model? So 37 Signals has recently tried to do this. For example, they've done it with their Slack competitor where they say, hey, everybody's fed up with paying huge Slack fees. How about you just pay us once? I don't know how successful it's going to be, but it's an example of a counter position. Like, we are going to take value in a different way. The current market is committed to how they take value. The classic example is like a Netflix and a Blockbuster, right? It's like, well, Blockbuster's committed. They're doing well for themselves. They're not going to charge this way. And so we are going to do it, right? A lot of people have done this as like a distribution strategy when they're getting their business started. Other people charge for this information. We're going to give it away for free. That's like a counter positioning marketing example. There's a lot of crossover here. So I'm mixing these things. One example is like, you talked with a business broker earlier this morning. So typically a business broker is going to manage a transaction and they're going to take a success fee for that deal. Well, acquire.com came along and basically said, well, we're not going to take any success fees. What instead we're going to do is gather all the deals and give you access to the deals for an annual fee. It's an example of, you used to pay for access to buyers in this way. Now we're not even going to charge you for access to buyers because what we want is maximum amount of deals. We're going to charge the buyers to get access to the deals. And it's going to be ultimately more affordable for everyone. Plus, we have a network effect going. This is a way that you can sort of counter position. If your competition is charging for one thing, you could potentially give that thing away for free and then charge for something else.
This is a good one, Dan. It's also a bit tricky in my mind because it's where personally my mind goes to first, which is like, oh, I'll just do the opposite or I'll just be defiant, right? And so you come up with this strategy. It's like, well, they charge by the minute. I'm going to charge by the hour. In the example of Acquire, well, I'm just going to charge people $300 a month instead of this large brokerage fee. The problem, though, may arise when there is something that you don't understand about the industry or a specific way in which it operates. So if you're going to execute on this, highly recommend being in the industry, because from the outside looking in, I think a lot of this stuff looks really appealing in terms of a disruption type of model. But I think once you get in there, a lot of times you start to understand why they charge a certain way. It's like, oh, wait, this doesn't work because I'm not making any money.
Yeah.
In the case of 37 Signals, they've been smoking the fumes of Basecamp for a good 20 years. These guys have a serious business and cash reserves on their hands. So they can come in and build this once product, this hey product, and reposition it against the competition because they can afford to do it.
Yeah. And you could actually look at Superhuman and Hey, which are email services, which are premium, as a type of counter positioning to Gmail and free providers, where if you're frustrated with those and you want more services, we are actually charging for the value we deliver. And that's going to be a win-win. So it's a way to counter position against the norm. And I agree, some of these like power methodologies, they can focus on like winner take all markets, or they can be sort of focused on larger players. I'm kind of talking through this stuff to see what can resonate with more early stage bootstrapped businesses. One example with us is what we saw in the recruiting industry is that everybody was charging 20% of first year salary to do recruiting. And we just thought that that value proposition didn't work for bootstrappers. So we figured out a model. We mapped it out and we're like, well, we don't have to charge based on the first year salary. We'll just charge based on our wages to go find that person. And that became a flat rate recruiting model. So a version of counter positioning, and that's still going really well for us. What you mentioned is we've also realized why recruiters charge 20% of first year salary. So for a meaningful percentage of our deals now, we also do that. That's turned out to be a great business for us. And I do think the counter positioning is what got us in the door. Like Rob Walling wrote about as a little bit of a brand touch, brand power in the SaaS playbook, mentioned remote first recruiting specifically for that counter position. Hey, everybody else is out here charging this. These guys are charging flat rate. That's a great deal for fund strapped SaaS founders. And we have a great relationship with the Tiny Seed community. Now, to your point, like how powerful is that counter position if you don't win the market, right? Now, there's a lot of recruiting agencies that do flat rate recruiting. And so that's not ended up being the sustainable source of power that some of these other businesses where it was like much more disruptive and much more of a winner take all. And they also developed more robust forms of power. If you look at remote first recruiting as a company, it's essentially like our community and our podcast that builds the trust and distribution and brand. And then that's why we get business there. It's not the counter positioning thing didn't ultimately end up being the spearhead that drove a lot of that revenue. Like we said, there's 7 powers. There's a bunch of the other ones that we'll skip over. The final one I want to talk about is what the author of 7 Powers, Helmer, suggests is the most difficult to build. However, there might be some ways that bootstrappers can think about short-circuiting this and getting some of this power a little bit earlier in the game. And that power is brand. And you can think about it like sort of related to Cornered Resource. Like, what is that message that only you are really willing to distribute out in the world? And what can people know about your company that's unique and singular? I thought about this when I was watching Alex Hormozy on YouTube talk about selling his last business. And obviously, Alex has invested, he's said publicly, 7 figures a year in growing his brand. And he's done that. The brand with the muscle shirts and the hat and the style.
Nasal strip.
The nasal strip. It's an interesting brand. It's compelling. It's unique. It's interesting. But the thing he mentioned is that he didn't get a good deal on selling his last business. I think it was Gym Launch or something. But he said that the reason he sold it was for the number. That for him, call it a controlled resource, call it a unique brand touch, call it something that can gain distribution. He wanted to be able to have the credibility of, I sold my business for this much. And he was going to roll out that first year of heavy distribution, heavy brand based on that unique identifier. I am a young person. I have sold a business for this much. You don't see that on YouTube, and get a load of my nasal strip. And this turned out to be a very effective way to gain notoriety for that, essentially to attract founders that want to give him equity in their business, which was the next plan as I understand it. But I do think it's an interesting moment how rather than optimize for the financial outcome of that sale, it was simply the number he needed. According to him, he left money on the table so that his name would be associated with that number. And it was on ink. And then he could go to YouTube and say, I'm the $53 million man. And I think that's part of his brand. And that he knew from being in the industry of success coaches and stuff and gurus that having that number would be a unique identifier of his brand within that opportunity window. And that's the other thing about these powers is that there's opportunity windows, moments in time when you can exploit these things. Hey, if I can go to YouTube with $1 million of these dollars with the nasal strip and with the 53 million, I can build a brand around that.
It's also not forever either. That was a moment in time. And I think by the time he's done doing whatever he's going to be doing, that's just going to be part of the story. That's going to be the parlay into this version that's going on right now. And it'll be interesting to see what the next couple pivots are as well. It's not the
Yeah.
end of the story.
Well, it's interesting too how power gets baked into potentially like company actions down the line. So in theory, Alex can cut more favorable terms than his competition. So again, we're back to power, which is like pricing edge. And if the business model leans on equity, ownership, and then maybe even control opportunities, now he's bought in at a better rate than other investors.
Yeah, you look at an organization like YC, Y Combinator, the brand that they have, the best companies in the world are competing to give away equity in their organizations.
Typically, these powers progress. So you start with like a cornered resource, and then maybe you figure out distribution. And maybe there's like you're doing some counter positioning there. Maybe there's some network effects and some switching costs. Maybe you're achieving some kind of economy of scale. And then ultimately, brand is like the resulting power, be it Toyota, Rolex, Harley Davidson. Often they've progressed through. And so I do think it's interesting to look at brand and to ask yourself if that's where you all want to end up. The reason Rolex can get more margin on their watches than the next brand is because it's widely agreed and acknowledged that that is the best watch. Then what are some ways that you can bake that into what you're doing sooner? And one of the potentials here that's potentially more affordable is on design and uniqueness. A lot of us put this off and don't take it as seriously. And there's a potential to move faster here and to gain power in the marketplace and to build trust by starting off with a killer website, starting off with a killer testimonial section, starting off with in-depth stories, case studies, walk-around documentaries. There are ways that when you do capture attention, that brand can potentially give you a form of pricing power. There's a workshop in Austin every other week. And it's interesting to see the difference in pricing. Certain brands, that workshop is like $200. And certain brands, that workshop is like $700. And then Cody Sanchez's is $5,000. And essentially, those workshops have similar formats. But what Cody Sanchez has developed in the past few years is the brand. There's an aura, there's a bit of a Rolex aura emerging around it, which is like, well, maybe she's the best right now, versus a company that is a little bit drier, doesn't put as much attention to detail on those touches. It's interesting clicking around because I have signed up for multiple workshops. And then I was like, oh, Cody's doing one. I have to check that out. And then I was looking through her website and stuff, and I was like, all of this stuff's on point. This is like on point across the way. And it was very appealing. And so am I willing to pay 5x the price for a similar experience, which is essentially like mentoring, coaching, and masterminding? And the answer is, yeah, I mean, maybe that works. It's obviously working, right? I think the way to short circuit this is to keep your battlefronts focused, have a smaller website with less content, but the content's done incredibly well is an example of that. Or have, one channel, but done incredibly well.
Just to be clear, we're also throwing a workshop in Austin in September, and it's free. So I just want to point that out.
We are learning as we go. So there you go. I do agree with you. Brand is an interesting one to think about. Traditionally, it is considered the most expensive to develop. It is expensive to ultimately develop this trust. The ultimate examples of this are the LVMH group of brands, where because these are heritage brands that have been worn by celebrities and that have these great stories and great packaging and design, just like, yes, I will pay 10x for that bag than I will for a frankly comparable bag. That is a very tricky thing to achieve. Toyota might have achieved it with their Land Cruiser brand, right? But again, think about the heritage of the Land Cruiser. And it's hard to come out with something right away that has that kind of brand image that drives that kind of margin. Ford has probably done it with their F-150, a very high margin product that people just default think like that's the American truck. And when you look at the public records on it, it is the high margin truck. This sort of brand touch, being known for the go-to, the obvious, the trusted, is a sustaining source of pricing leverage. Back to the original point, the whole thought exercise here is your business seeking out opportunities, or is your business the opportunity to own? And how can we bridge that gap? We can potentially doing it by thinking about it through the lens of power. So there you go. This is a very wonky one, Ian. I don't know how it's going to go over. It's in the weeds, but what I've noticed is that these are the weeds that we are thinking about with our clients on a day-to-day basis. What are we going to place our bet on? Where's our opportunity window? Are we going to go after distribution? How much are we investing in our brand? Or are we going to start counter positioning? Are we going to start to develop some kind of network effect? Or are we going to have the bravery to own our cornered resource and put it out there into the world? So these are the sorts of things that can help us to start get better margins and sustaining pricing power as we grow our businesses. So not just scale for scale's sake.
Hey, are you curious which one of these powers you might have in your business? Like Dan mentioned at the top of the show, drop us an email. We want to do this under the hood segment, this business breakdown segment. Drop us a line, answer a few questions, and maybe we can dig into this with you on your business.
Cool. Those questions will be at the post of this one. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening to the pod.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Tropical MBA podcast. You can go to tropicalmba.com, get access to hundreds of back episodes and all kinds of other goodies. Load up your iPod. That is the cheapest way to fly business class on your next international flight. We will see you next Thursday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.